The key didn't turn. That was the first thing. Not the rage that came later. Slow and architectural, built brick by brick over the weeks that followed. Not the humiliation, which would arrive fully formed at a Thursday morning in a conference room full of strangers. No, the first thing was simply the key not turning. And the particular quality of silence that falls when a mechanism that has worked 10,000 times suddenly refuses to work one more. My name is irrelevant to the story. What matters is what I was holding. A key, a set of scrubs still carrying the antiseptic smell of a 12-hour ICU shift. A paper bag with a gas station sandwich I'd bought at 2:30 in the morning because the hospital cafeteria had run out of everything except a lemon yogurt I didn't want. 41 years old. 11 years as a registered nurse. 11 years of night shifts, holiday shifts, the shifts nobody else wanted because nobody else needed the overtime the way I needed it. The key didn't turn. I stood there on the front porch of a house I'd been paying for since 2013. I thought, the lock is stuck. I've been on my feet for 12 hours. My hands are tired. I tried again. Then again. Then I stepped back and looked at the door the way you look at something that has just quietly betrayed you. And I saw it. The hardware was new, brushed nickel, where before it had been the original brass that came with the house. Someone had replaced the lock while I was at work. While I was administering medication and checking vitals and holding the hand of a 73-year-old man who was afraid to die alone at 3 in the morning, someone had gone to a hardware store, bought a new lock set, and installed it on the door of the house I paid for. I should tell you about the house because the house is not just a setting. The house is the entire argument. We bought it. And I use that word carefully because, as you'll come to understand, the pronoun is doing a great deal of heavy lifting in March of 2013. 31 years old, I had been with my then partner Marcus for 4 years. We had dated since nursing school, moved in together when I got my first hospital posting. And by the time we were looking at houses, I had come to understand something about Marcus that I hadn't fully articulated to myself yet. He was a man who was very good at being present for the exciting moments and very scarce during the unglamorous ones. He was there for the house tours. He was not there for the loan applications. The mortgage was in my name. This was framed at the time as a practical matter. Marcus was self-employed. Freelance graphic design, some web work, variable income. The bank, he explained with the patient reasonableness of someone who has prepared for this conversation, would look more favorably on a single applicant with stable W-2 income than on a joint application that introduced variability. He said this the way people say things that are technically true but constructed to prevent further questions. And I, exhausted from a stretch of back-to-back shifts and genuinely happy to be buying a home, did not ask the further questions. The mortgage was in my name, $4,200 a month. Marcus moved in. His mother moved in 6 months later, following a story about her landlord that changed its details slightly every time it was told. His younger sister Drea moved into the basement the following spring. By the time our daughter Nora was born in 2015, there were 4 adults in the house I was paying for, and the distribution of labor had achieved a kind of perfect, terrible equilibrium. I worked nights, I slept days, and everyone else occupied the house as though it were a communal space that had simply materialized around them through some benevolent act of the universe. Marcus designed logos. He was talented. Genuinely, this is not a story where I am obliged to pretend the other party had no qualities. He was talented and charming, and he had a way of being the most interesting person in any room that I had found intoxicating at 27 and found suffocating by 38. But talent and charm do not pay for a 30-year fixed mortgage at 1% interest. The mortgage paid for the mortgage every month automatically from the account where my paychecks were deposited. Drea paid nominal rent, $300 a month, which covered approximately the increase in our utility bills. Marcus's mother paid nothing on the understanding that she watched Nora while I slept after night shifts, which was true, and which I was grateful for, and which I also came to understand was leverage held over me as much as it was a contribution to the household. I want you to understand the arithmetic. Not because this story is about money. It isn't. Not really, but because the arithmetic is what they forgot. When you are invisible long enough, people stop seeing the structure that holds the roof over their heads. They start to believe the roof is simply there. Over 11 years, From 2013 to 2024, I paid the mortgage. $4,200 a month, 37 consecutive months of overtime on top of base salary to cover the down payment and initial costs. Property taxes averaging $6,800 a year. Homeowners insurance, the roof replacement in 2019 that cost $22,000. The HVAC system in 2021. Nora's school fees, her medical, her everything. I have the bank statements. All of them. 11 years of them, organized into annual folders in a filing cabinet in my old bedroom that, and this is one of the details I will return to, they did not change the locks on. Perhaps because they forgot it had a lock, or perhaps because they assumed I would never think to look at what was inside it as evidence. They were wrong about that. The night I found the new lock, I called Marcus's cell phone. It went to voicemail. I called the house line and heard it ring through the door and nobody answered. I sat on the front step for 20 minutes because I didn't know what else to do. I was wearing compression socks and scrubs, and I had a gas station sandwich, and I was sitting outside a house I had paid $1.4 million into over 11 years. I'm including total interest, insurance, taxes, and capital improvements in that figure, and I will show you where every dollar is documented. And I could not get inside. I want to tell you what I did not do. I did not scream. I did not call the police and make a scene. I did not throw the sandwich at the door. What I did was call my friend Paulette, who had a sofa I'd helped her move into her apartment 7 years ago, and who answered on the second ring the way old friends do when they sense, even at 3 a.m, that the call is serious. "I need a place to sleep," I said. She said, "Come." And that was the first night of the rest of my life. I didn't know it then. I thought it was a misunderstanding. A miscommunication, a stupid, fixable problem that would resolve itself with a conversation. I was a nurse. I had spent 11 years in rooms where people fought for their lives. I knew what a serious situation looked like. I thought I was handling something minor. I was wrong about that too. Paulette's sofa was a sectional in beige microfiber, and it was one of the most important places I have ever slept. Because it was on that sofa over 3 mornings in a row while Paulette was at work, that I started to actually look at my own life. I mean that literally. I had a laptop and my phone and time and silence, 3 things I had not had in meaningful combination in years. And I began to reconstruct, from bank records and pay stubs and tax returns and old emails, the precise financial architecture of the life I had been living. The numbers were not a surprise. I had always known in the abstract what I was paying. What I had not done was write it down all in one place, because writing it down in one place is the kind of thing that makes an abstract understanding become a concrete reckoning, and I think part of me had not been ready for the reckoning. I was ready now. Here's what I found. From March 2013 through October 2024, 140 months, I made every single mortgage payment. The record showed no exceptions. On months when the account ran low, there were transfers in from my savings. On months when I worked triple overtime, the surplus went directly into the escrow reserve. The mortgage company had my cell phone number as the primary contact. My email received every statement, every escrow adjustment notice, every refinancing offer. My credit score, which I checked on Paulette's sofa at 9:17 in the morning on the first day, was 791. Marcus's name did not appear on the mortgage. His name did not appear on the deed. We had never married. Another practical matter. Another reasonable-sounding explanation given at a time when I was too busy to push back. We had been together 14 years. We had a daughter together. His name was not on a single document related to that house. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because here is what I think happened. At some point, years ago, Marcus or his mother or someone in that household began to believe that duration creates ownership, that living somewhere long enough, being a family in a place long enough, generates some form of right that supersedes the legal paperwork. That the mortgage was a technicality, that the deed was a technicality, that the person who signed for everything and paid for everything was also, in some sense, a technicality. I do not know when this belief took hold. I do not know if it was discussed openly or if it accreted silently, the way bad ideas often do, through 10,000 small moments of not being challenged. What I know is that when I sat on Paulette's sofa and looked at the documents, I understood that the lock change was not an act of passion. It was not something Marcus had done in anger after a fight. We hadn't had a fight. We'd had a disagreement 3 weeks prior about Nora's fall schedule. A normal, manageable parenting disagreement. And then the kind of cold quiet that follows those conversations, and then my shifts, and then 3 weeks later, a new lock. This had been planned. Sound. A long silence. Then the coffee cup set down. I called a lawyer on the second day at Paulette's. I found her through the hospital's employee assistance program, a domestic legal consultation benefit I had been paying into for 6 years without ever using, which felt in that moment like a particular form of poetry. Her name was Catherine Osei. She was a family and property attorney with 22 years of experience and a manner so calm and precise that I understood immediately why people hired her. I explained the situation. She listened without interrupting for 11 minutes. I watched the clock. And then she said 6 words that rearranged my understanding of everything. "Is your name on the deed?" I said yes. She said, "Then they trespassed. Not, then you should get a lawyer, or then you have options." She said they trespassed in the house I owned. The people I had housed and fed and insured for 11 years had, by changing the lock without my knowledge or consent, committed an act that had a precise legal name and a precise legal remedy. While I was at Paulette's those first few days, Marcus texted twice. The first text said, "We need to talk." The second, sent 14 hours later when I hadn't responded, said, "This is for the best and you know it." His mother called once and left a voicemail I still have in which she said, "And I'm going to give you the precise language because the precise language matters." She said, "You need to come get your things from the guest room. We're going to need that space." The guest room. 11 years. The guest room. I saved the voicemail. I saved all of it. Catherine's first step was a title search, which confirmed what I already knew. My name, sole and exclusive, on the deed. The house had a current appraised value, based on the county assessment plus comparable sales in the neighborhood, of approximately $617,000. The remaining mortgage balance per the most recent statement I pulled was $208,000. Equity, roughly $409,000. My equity, my name, my 11 years. The second thing Catherine did was send a formal notice, certified mail, signature required, to the property address, addressed to Marcus and his mother Andrea, informing them that as non-owning occupants of a property they had altered without the owner's consent, they were required to restore access immediately or face a formal unlawful detainer proceeding. She included the applicable state statutes. She included a demand for a full accounting of any alterations made to the property during my absence. The notice arrived on a Tuesday. I know this because I was tracking the certified mail status on my phone while working a shift, checking it between patient rounds, which is one of those images that captures something about the particular madness of that period. Administering a blood pressure medication with one hand, refreshing a USPS tracking page with the other. Marcus called Catherine's office, not mine, which told me everything about how he had understood the situation right up until the moment he understood it differently. He told her paralegal that this was a family matter, and he didn't think lawyers needed to be involved. The paralegal, with the particular courtesy of someone who has heard this before, informed him that the matter had already been filed with the county and that family status did not affect property law. He called me 20 minutes later. I didn't answer. Not because I was being strategic. Not because Catherine had told me not to, though she had suggested I route communication through her office. I didn't answer because I was standing in the hallway outside a patient's room and I was a professional and I was at work, and those were the only 2 things I was able to hold on to that week. I was a professional and I was at work. The house would be handled by the law. The law was not ambiguous. What the law said was, I own the house. I had never relinquished ownership. No common law property claim existed because we had never been married. No tenancy agreement existed because no rent had ever been paid by Marcus or his mother. And here is something Catherine's paralegal discovered when she pulled financial records during discovery. The $300 Drea paid monthly had been deposited into Marcus's personal account, not into the household account, not into the mortgage account, not anywhere that touched the actual expenses of the house. He had been collecting his sister's rent on my house and keeping it. I have the account records. I need to tell you about the patent because this is the part that people never see coming, including me. I am a nurse. Specifically, was at that time, a critical care RN with a specialty in patient monitoring systems. Over the course of my career, I had spent years watching the workarounds that nurses develop in ICUs. The improvised cable management, the alarm fatigue solutions, the small practical inventions that never get written down because nurses are not typically in rooms where patents are filed. In 2019, during a 3-week leave I had taken, supposedly a vacation, in reality a period where I was trying to prevent myself from collapsing under the weight of working nights and managing a household and raising a child with minimal support, I had spent most of that time in Paulette's spare room, writing down a monitoring system modification I had been developing in my head for 2 years. A small thing, a hardware-software interface that reduced false alarm rates in multi-patient ICU pods by creating a hierarchy system based on patient acuity scores. Paulette had a brother who worked in medical device licensing. He had read my notes. He had said, "This is actually interesting." He had connected me with a patent attorney. I had filed a provisional patent application in November 2019. I had, in the chaos of everything, the HVAC replacement, Nora starting school, Marcus's mother's medical appointments, the pandemic beginning 4 months later, forgotten to think about it much. The patent attorney had handled the conversion to a full application. I had paid the fees from my personal account. Marcus had known I was working on some nursing thing and had expressed neither interest nor curiosity, which had been characteristic enough that I hadn't pushed. In September 2022, U.S. patent number, and I will not read the full number for privacy reasons, but I have it, Catherine has it, and the United States Patent and Trademark Office certainly has it, was issued in my name. In 2023, a medical device company had approached the patent attorney about licensing discussions. Those discussions had been ongoing. I want to be careful here about what I say, because licensing negotiations involve confidentiality provisions that I am obligated to respect. What I can tell you is that the discussions involved a multi-year licensing agreement. What I can tell you is that the figures discussed were not small. What I can tell you is that my patent attorney had been emailing me at an address I checked in frequently, and that when I sat on Paulette's sofa in October 2024 with nothing but time and a laptop, I found 11 months of emails I had not read. I sat there for a long time. Then I called my patent attorney. Then I called Paulette and asked if she needed anything from the grocery store, because I needed to walk around a block several times before I could be still again. Sound. A conference room, air conditioning, chairs being adjusted, the soft sound of documents being organized. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in November. It was not a trial, let me be specific. What Catherine had filed was an unlawful detainer action combined with a petition for exclusive possession pending partition proceedings. In a jurisdiction where, as the sole legal owner of a property occupied by non-owning parties who had altered access without consent, I was entitled to seek both immediate re-entry and a formal legal determination of the property's status. The partition component was relevant because although I was the sole owner, there were questions that Marcus's attorney had introduced about equitable contribution claims based on years of occupancy and domestic partnership. Marcus had gotten a lawyer. His lawyer's name was Gerald Fitch. I know this because Catherine mentioned it with the particular neutrality that attorneys deploy when they consider opposing counsel to be manageable. The hearing was in a mid-sized conference room at the county courthouse's civil division. Present, myself, Catherine, Gerald Fitch, Marcus, his mother, who had not been required to attend but had come anyway, which I noted, and a court-appointed mediator named Harold, who looked like someone who had heard every possible version of every possible domestic property dispute and had arrived at a state of complete serenity about it. I had a binder. I want to describe this binder because it represents 11 years of my life compressed into 4 inches of organized documentation. Tabbed, indexed. Catherine had helped me organize it, but the content was mine. Every mortgage statement, every property tax receipt, every insurance payment, every contractor invoice, every wire transfer, Every bank statement showing the automatic mortgage withdrawal from my account on the first of every month for 140 months. I also had a second, thinner binder. This one contained the patent filing, the issuance certificate, and a summary letter from my patent attorney describing the status of the licensing discussions. Catherine had argued successfully that the patent was relevant to the partition proceedings because Marcus's equitable contribution claim rested on the assertion that his domestic partnership, his presence in the home, his emotional and practical contributions had added value to the marital estate, which he was characterizing the household as despite the absence of any actual marriage. The counter-argument was straightforward. The asset generating the most significant prospective value in my financial picture was one I had conceived, developed, filed, and prosecuted entirely independently during a period when Marcus had shown zero engagement with the process and which was registered solely in my name. The contribution argument cuts both ways. If we are measuring who contributed what, the audit is comprehensive. Gerald Fitch had filed a 12-page brief arguing equitable contribution. It cited case law about long-term domestic partnerships. It used words like constructive trust and unjust enrichment, which are real legal concepts, and it deployed them with the confidence of a man who believed that 12 years of living in a house someone else paid for constituted a form of equity. Catherine's response was 4 pages. It included a single exhibit, a spreadsheet, 140 rows, 1 row per month, columns, mortgage amount, source account, balance before withdrawal, balance after, payment confirmation number. At the bottom, a total. I will not read the total aloud. It was large. It was documented to the dollar. It was inarguable. Harold the mediator looked at the spreadsheet for approximately 45 seconds. Then he looked at Gerald Fitch. Gerald Fitch said something about the nature of domestic contribution being difficult to quantify in purely financial terms, which is a sentence that contains a correct observation deployed in the service of a dishonest argument. Domestic contribution is indeed difficult to quantify, but the mortgage payment is not domestic contribution. The mortgage payment is the mortgage payment, and it has a number. And the number was on the spreadsheet, and the spreadsheet had 140 rows. Marcus was sitting across the table from me. This was the first time I had seen him in person since before the lock change. He looked, and I want to be precise here, not dramatic. He looked like a man who had told himself a story about how this meeting would go, and was now watching that story fail to be true. His mother sat next to him. At one point, she said, without anyone asking her to speak, that she had contributed to the household by providing childcare. Harold noted her comment. Catherine placed another document on the table. It was a letter from the hospital's employee records department confirming my schedule over the preceding 5 years. The shifts, the hours, the overtime designations. It was accompanied by a calculation, prepared by an economist Catherine had retained, estimating the market rate for the childcare services provided as an offset against the imputed rent for a 3-bedroom house in our county over the same period. The market rate for childcare, even at modest regional estimates, was significantly less than the imputed rent for occupying a $600,000 property. The net figure was not in Marcus's mother's favor. She stopped speaking. What happened over the next hour was not dramatic in the way that courtroom television is dramatic. There were no outbursts. No one cried. Harold facilitated with the steady efficiency of someone running a meeting that he already knew the outcome of. Gerald Fitch made several arguments. Catherine responded to each of them with a document. The lock change photographs, taken by me on my phone the morning I discovered the new hardware, time-stamped, geotagged, submitted into evidence, were particularly difficult for Marcus's side to address. Gerald Fitch characterized the lock change as a good faith safety measure, following relationship difficulties. Catherine asked him to specify which safety concern necessitated changing the lock before notifying the property owner. He was unable to specify. The voicemail from Marcus's mother, "You need to come get your things from the guest room," was played on a small speaker Catherine had brought for this purpose. Harold listened with his hands folded. Marcus looked at the table. By 11:30 in the morning, Gerald Fitch requested a recess to confer with his client. During the recess, I sat in the hallway with Catherine and drank water from a paper cup, and she explained, with professional calm, that the only question remaining was the terms. The facts were not in dispute. The property was mine. The occupants had no legal claim to continued tenancy. The only negotiable element was the timeline for vacation of the premises and whether Marcus would withdraw his equitable contribution claim voluntarily or require it to be dismissed at a further hearing, which would cost him money and achieve the same outcome. "What do you want?" she asked. I thought about 11 years. I thought about the night shifts and the gas station sandwiches and the locked door at 3 in the morning. I thought about Nora, who was 9, and who I would be co-parenting with Marcus regardless of everything else, and for whose sake I had been and would continue to be reasonable. I said, I want the house. I want the patent left entirely out of any negotiated settlement. I want 60 days for them to find alternative housing. And I want the guest room voicemail entered permanently into the record. Catherine almost smiled. The recess lasted 22 minutes. When Gerald Fitch came back, he said they would agree to a 60-day vacation timeline and a full dismissal of the equitable contribution claim, in exchange for my agreement not to pursue the unlawful detainer charges criminally. I agreed. It was over. They were out in 51 days, not 60. 51. I do not know if this was efficiency or if the 9 extra days were some form of face-saving punctuality, arriving early as though that changed anything. What I know is that on a Sunday morning in January, I stood in the driveway of my house with a locksmith I had hired, and I watched a new lock be installed. A good one, a deadbolt with a reinforced strike plate. And then the locksmith handed me 2 keys, and I put one in my pocket and I stood on the porch for a while. The house was in reasonable condition. They had taken their furniture and personal items. The kitchen had been cleaned. Nora's room had been cleared of her things, which were now in the apartment I'd rented 3 months earlier and which had become, unexpectedly, something I was grateful for. A space that was entirely mine, chosen by me, uncompromised, where I had slept without a background hum of performance for the first time in a decade. I walked through every room. The guest room. The room Marcus's mother had informed me I needed to come collect my things from, contained the filing cabinet, undisturbed. 11 years of records, still organized in their annual folders. I stood in front of it and I felt something that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite relief. It was more like clarity. The particular sensation of seeing a thing as it actually is. Sound, a filing cabinet drawer opening and closing. I kept the house. I thought I might sell it. For months during the proceedings, I had been unsure whether I wanted the history of the place or just the asset. But when I walked through it that January morning and it was quiet and mine, and exactly as I had left it, I understood that I didn't want to give it up. I had paid for it. I had every right to decide what to do with it, and what I decided was to stay. I repainted the guest room. I am telling you this because it is important. The guest room is now an office. It has a desk and good lighting and a filing cabinet that still holds 11 years of records, which I keep because they are mine, and because having them makes me feel the particular security of someone who has learned the cost of not keeping their documentation. The licensing agreement was finalized in March. I am not going to tell you the specific terms. What I will tell you is that the proceeds were deposited into an account in my name, and that I used a portion to pay the mortgage ahead, and that Nora's college fund now looks different than it did, and that I donated a meaningful amount to a foundation that provides legal aid to people navigating domestic property disputes who cannot afford an attorney. Because here's the thing I kept returning to during those months. I could afford Catherine. I had good credit and hospital employment, and an employee assistance program that got me in the door. Most people in the situation I was in, sole income partners who have been housing others on informal arrangements for years, and who discover suddenly that the arrangement was never mutual. Most of those people cannot access what I accessed. The lock change is not a rare thing. The invisibility is not a rare thing. The sense that duration creates ownership, that the person who keeps the lights on can be managed and maneuvered and eventually discarded. That belief exists everywhere, and it ruins people who don't have the paperwork or the lawyer or the time to sit on a sofa and reconstruct their own life. I think about them. Marcus and I have achieved what I would call a functional co-parenting arrangement. This is not reconciliation. I want to be clear about that because I think clarity is owed. We speak about Nora, We coordinate school events and medical appointments and the logistics of her life with a professionalism that she has, at 9 years old, begun to comment on in the way that children comment on things that are unusual by their standards. "You and Daddy are weirdly nice to each other," she said once. I considered this for a moment and said that her dad and I were doing our best to take care of her. Which is true. Which is, I think, exactly the amount of truth a 9-year-old needs. What I have not done is forgiven in any way that asks me to forget. These are different things. Forgiveness as a spiritual or emotional practice is something I am working on privately, with a therapist I started seeing in February, and it is my business and not part of this story. But forgetting? Pretending the lock change was an aberration? Pretending 11 years of invisibility was an accident? Pretending that the guest room comment was made without full knowledge of what it meant? That is not something I'm interested in performing for anyone's comfort. Marcus's mother lives with Drea now. I understand they are renting. I understand the rent is higher than it would have been if they had not had to find emergency housing in January. I understand that their situation is not comfortable. I notice that I do not feel responsible for their comfort, which is something I had to practice feeling because for 11 years, my default was to feel responsible for everyone's comfort at the expense of my own. I am still practicing. There are things I should have done differently. I want to name them because this story is not useful to anyone if it implies that I was simply a perfect victim of uniquely monstrous people. I should have put Marcus on the mortgage, or not put him in the house. The ambiguity of "we live here but only she owns it" was something I allowed to be ambiguous because resolving it would have required a conversation I didn't want to have. I chose the path of least resistance and called it pragmatism. I should have had a cohabitation agreement. Catherine, when I told her this story from the beginning, noted this with the gentle firmness of someone who explains the same thing to many clients and has stopped adding "I'm sorry" to the observation. I should have, and this one is harder, I should have recognized earlier that a relationship in which one person works and pays and the other person is simply present is not a partnership. It is a patronage arrangement wearing a partnership's clothing, and the distinction matters. And I missed it for 11 years because I was too tired to look. These are not moral failures. They are practical errors. I name them not to distribute blame across myself, but to say, the documents are not only protection against others, they are protection against your own willingness to avoid the hard conversations that the documents would make necessary. I went back to nights in February, by choice. I am a night shift nurse the way some people are morning people. It suits something in me, the particular quality of a hospital at 3 a.m., the way the building settles into what it actually is when the administrative layer sleeps, and it becomes just the patients and the nurses and the monitors and the work. I like the work. I have always liked the work. On the nights when I come home, when I pull into my driveway and walk up to my front door and use my key, the new one with the reinforced deadbolt, I sometimes stand on the porch for a moment before I go in. Not long, just long enough to feel the specific texture of arriving somewhere that is yours. There is a quality to it that I cannot fully describe. It is not triumphant. Triumph implies an audience, and the porch is usually empty at 3:30 in the morning. It is quieter than triumph. It is the feeling of a fact. I paid for this. This is mine. I know what it cost because I have all the receipts. And I am standing here holding the key, and the key turns.